In 1933, the United States government did something unprecedented in American history. With the stroke of a pen, Franklin Roosevelt made it illegal for ordinary citizens to own gold. Executive Order 6102 forced Americans to surrender their gold coins, bullion, and certificates to the Federal Reserve for a fixed price of $20.67 per ounce. Violating this order meant up to 10 years in prison and a $10,000 fine. Within months, over 2,600 metric tons of gold were confiscated from American citizens. The government told people it was temporary, necessary for economic stability during the Great Depression. Many historians today argue this explanation was incomplete. 1 year later, Roosevelt devalued the dollar and revalued gold from $20 to $35 per ounce. Anyone who had surrendered their gold lost 69% of their wealth overnight. The government had initiated what analysts now describe as one of the largest wealth redistributions in American history, leaving many citizens feeling blindsided by the policy shift. But here's what terrifies me. A growing number of financial commentators believe the exact same pattern could be echoing in 2025 with Bitcoin, and most people have no idea what may be developing. On March 6, 2025, the current administration issued an executive order establishing America's first strategic Bitcoin reserve. They're calling it a national security measure. They claim it's about maintaining America's financial dominance in the digital age. But when you understand the mechanics of how this system actually works, when you see the legal framework they've constructed, when you examine the enforcement capabilities they've developed, some experts argue that deeper strategic motives may be at play. And the parallels between 1933 and 2025 are so precise, so methodical, that many analysts consider the similarities impossible to ignore. Let me show you exactly what they're doing, how they're doing it, and why many Bitcoin advocates are deeply worried about what this could mean for ordinary holders. Because the government that once confiscated gold from citizens is now centralizing significant amounts of Bitcoin through legal mechanisms already in place. And they're not just taking it from criminals anymore. According to legal scholars, the emerging framework could potentially expand the scope of government-held Bitcoin in the future. The strategic Bitcoin reserve sounds innocuous enough. The government will hold Bitcoin seized from criminal activities instead of auctioning it off. Makes sense, right? After all, they currently hold over 207,000 Bitcoin worth approximately $17 billion. These came from major seizures like Silk Road, from prosecuting ransomware groups, from shutting down darknet markets. Previously, the US Marshals would auction this Bitcoin to the public. Now, under the new executive order, they keep it forever. But here's where it gets interesting. The legal framework supporting this reserve isn't just about criminal seizures. Critics argue it represents a step toward significantly expanded authority over digital assets. The executive order references the Trading with the Enemy Act of 1917, the same law Roosevelt used to justify gold confiscation in 1933, the same law that allows the government to seize assets during national emergencies. Some policy analysts warn that this connection raises questions about how broadly these emergency powers might be interpreted. The Department of Justice has been systematically building what many describe as the most sophisticated cryptocurrency seizure apparatus in modern history. They can trace Bitcoin transactions across multiple wallets through mixing services across international borders. They've developed partnerships with blockchain analysis companies like Chainalysis and Elliptic that can follow every Satoshi from its creation to its current location. In the view of several cybersecurity experts, these capabilities create unprecedented transparency and also unprecedented government reach. When the government wants your Bitcoin, critics argue that these tools give them the ability to locate it with remarkable precision. October 14, 2025 proved just how advanced their capabilities have become. In coordination with international partners, US law enforcement executed one of the largest cryptocurrency confiscations in history. They seized $15 billion worth of Bitcoin, approximately 127,000 coins, from what they called a pig butchering scam network. But here's the critical detail everyone missed. These weren't just criminal proceeds sitting in obvious criminal wallets. This Bitcoin had been laundered through hundreds of unhosted wallets, mixed through privacy services, scattered across multiple jurisdictions. transactions. The fact that they could trace and seize this Bitcoin demonstrates capabilities that some civil liberties advocates find highly concerning. The government's seizure powers extend far beyond traditional criminal investigations. Under civil asset forfeiture laws, they can take your Bitcoin without ever proving you committed a crime. They just need to claim your Bitcoin is connected to criminal activity. The burden of proof falls on you to prove your innocence, not on them to prove your guilt. The Comprehensive Crime Control Act of 1984 and the Civil Asset Forfeiture Reform Act allow them to seize any asset tied to crimes, real or imagined. Legal analysts argue that this broad standard can sometimes capture innocent holders through complex transaction histories. Your Bitcoin doesn't have to be the proceeds of crime. It just has to have touched crime somewhere in its transaction history. And here's the part that alarms Bitcoin advocates. Some experts warn that nearly every Bitcoin has interacted with questionable activity at some point in its long, transparent public ledger. Bitcoin is fungible. One Bitcoin is identical to any other Bitcoin. But transaction history isn't fungible. According to blockchain researchers, even ordinary coins may show indirect links to older, unrelated transactions flagged years ago. If you receive Bitcoin that was previously used in a ransomware payment, or that passed through a darknet market, or that was involved in any transaction the government deems suspicious, critics caution that it could be at risk under existing forfeiture laws. They don't have to prove you knew about the previous criminal activity. They don't have to prove you participated in any crime. They just have to demonstrate a connection, however tenuous, between your Bitcoin and criminal activity. The blockchain analysis tools they use can trace connections going back years, sometimes to the original mining of the coins. If you bought Bitcoin on an exchange that later got shut down for money laundering, your Bitcoin is tainted. If you received payment in Bitcoin from someone who later got arrested, your Bitcoin is suspect. If you used a mixing service to protect your privacy, some regulators may interpret that as suspicious behavior. In the eyes of critics, the system has evolved to a point where Bitcoin ownership itself can become evidence of potential risk. But civil asset forfeiture is just the beginning. The real power lies in the emergency authorities they've been quietly accumulating. The Trading with the Enemy Act gives the president nearly unlimited power to control financial transactions during national emergencies. Under this law, Bitcoin becomes classified by some national security analysts as a potential vector for illicit finance, and anyone holding Bitcoin becomes a potential threat to national security, at least in the most extreme interpretations of the statute. Sound familiar? This is exactly how Roosevelt justified gold confiscation in 1933. The executive order establishing the Strategic Bitcoin Reserve includes language about protecting America's financial sovereignty from hostile nations. China holds an estimated 190,000 Bitcoin despite banning domestic trading. Russia has been accumulating Bitcoin as part of its sanctions-resilient strategy. North Korea uses Bitcoin to fund its nuclear program. These examples are often cited by policymakers as justification for expanding oversight. Bitcoin in private hands, some officials argue, could undermine America's ability to project financial power globally. Therefore, critics fear Bitcoin may eventually be centralized under greater government supervision. The infrastructure for mass Bitcoin centralization already exists. The government operates multiple task forces dedicated to cryptocurrency investigations. The FBI has a dedicated cryptocurrency unit. The IRS has criminal investigation teams specializing in digital assets. The Department of Homeland Security monitors blockchain transactions in real time. The Treasury Department can freeze Bitcoin addresses with sanctions. The court system has streamlined procedures for seizing digital assets. Every piece of the apparatus is in place, a fact that raises concern among Bitcoin advocates about how this system might be used in future emergencies. What they learned from 1933 is that compliance is easier to achieve than enforcement. Most Americans voluntarily surrendered their gold because they trusted their government. Only about 25% of gold was actually turned in, but that was enough to accomplish the government's goals. They didn't need to kick down every door and search every safe deposit box. They just needed enough compliance to centralize gold ownership and eliminate gold as a check on government monetary policy. Some financial historians believe a similar strategy could be applied to Bitcoin. They won't need to seize every Bitcoin wallet in America. They just need to seize enough to make Bitcoin ownership feel too risky for ordinary citizens. A few high-profile raids on Bitcoin holders, some prison sentences for people who refuse to surrender their private keys, or at least That is the scenario critics worry could unfold if emergency powers were ever invoked. Media coverage of Bitcoin seizures under national security authorities would amplify the effect. In the view of these analysts, fear, not force, would drive compliance. The government has spent years conditioning the public to accept cryptocurrency seizures as normal and necessary. Every time they announce a major Bitcoin seizure from criminals, it reinforces the idea, fair or not, that Bitcoin is frequently tied to crime. Every time they prosecute someone for using Bitcoin in ways regulators disapprove, they're establishing precedent for broader controls. Every time they expand their seizure authorities under the guise of fighting crime, critics argue they're building the legal framework for a future scenario where digital asset restrictions could become far more sweeping. The timing of this Bitcoin reserve isn't coincidental. It's coordinated with a broader global shift toward digital currency control that mirrors the monetary centralization of the 1930s. Central banks worldwide are launching their own digital currencies designed to eliminate financial privacy and give governments unprecedented control over every transaction. The Federal Reserve is developing a digital dollar. The European Central Bank is creating a digital euro. China already has its digital yuan operational. These central bank digital currencies aren't alternatives to Bitcoin. According to many critics, they represent a competing vision of money that emphasizes regulatory oversight and centralized control. When every transaction flows through government-controlled digital systems, Bitcoin becomes the last refuge for financial privacy and independence. That's precisely why some analysts believe policymakers may view it as a challenge to their authority. A government that can monitor every purchase, control every payment, and freeze every account may have incentives to reduce reliance on parallel monetary systems outside their direct oversight. Bitcoin represents the same threat to monetary policy flexibility that gold represented to paper money manipulation in 1933, at least in the minds of certain financial commentators. The enforcement mechanisms they're developing extend far beyond domestic seizures. The government is building international cooperation frameworks that will make Bitcoin seizures in specific criminal contexts a global operation. They're sharing blockchain analysis tools with allied nations. They're coordinating seizure operations across multiple jurisdictions. They're creating mutual legal assistance treaties that fast-track cryptocurrency confiscations. Policy experts warn that these collaborative structures, while aimed at criminal activity, could theoretically be applied more broadly under extreme emergency conditions. When they move against Bitcoin, critics fear it won't be limited to American soil. Look at what happened with the $15 billion seizure in October. That operation involved coordination with multiple countries, shared intelligence from various agencies, and simultaneous enforcement actions across different time zones. They traced Bitcoin through mixing services across international borders, through complex laundering schemes that took years to unravel. If they can do that for criminal investigations, skeptics argue it demonstrates how powerful the system could become if ever expanded to non-criminal asset controls under emergency authority. The legal precedents they're establishing go far beyond cryptocurrency. Every expansion of seizure authority, every new surveillance capability, every emergency power they claim becomes permanent. The Trading with the Enemy Act was passed in 1917 as a wartime measure. It's still being used over a century later to justify peacetime asset restrictions. The emergency authorities they're claiming to combat crypto crime are viewed by some legal scholars as a potential template for much broader financial oversight in the future. They're also learning from the mistakes of 1933. Roosevelt's gold confiscation worked because gold was physically difficult to hide and impossible to transport secretly. Bitcoin is different. It exists as information. Private keys can be memorized, hidden in plain sight, transmitted instantly across the globe. The government understands this, which is why they're not just building seizure capabilities, they're building surrender incentives. The Strategic Bitcoin Reserve includes provisions for voluntary surrender programs. Citizens who voluntarily turn over their Bitcoin will receive fair market value compensation. Citizens who hide their Bitcoin and get caught face criminal prosecution, asset forfeiture, and potential terrorism-related charges if their Bitcoin is deemed to have financed illicit activities. Critics interpret this as a carrot-and-stick approach similar to previous historical asset control campaigns, though the government positions it strictly as a law enforcement framework. But the real genius of their strategy lies in the regulatory choke points they've been constructing around Bitcoin. You can hide your private keys, but you can't hide your need to convert Bitcoin back to dollars for everyday expenses. Every exchange is monitored. Every transaction above certain thresholds is reported. Every conversion to fiat currency creates a paper trail that leads directly to your door. They don't need to find your Bitcoin. Analysts argue they only need to regulate the gateways where Bitcoin meets the traditional economy. The banks are already cooperating. Major financial institutions are refusing to process payments from cryptocurrency exchanges. Credit card companies are blocking purchases of Bitcoin. Payment processors are terminating accounts linked to cryptocurrency transactions. The traditional financial system is increasingly aligned with regulatory expectations, cutting Bitcoin off from broader economic access. When you can't spend your Bitcoin and can't convert it to usable currency, some experts warn its value becomes dependent on a narrowing set of use cases. This financial isolation serves multiple purposes. It drives down Bitcoin's price, making it easier for the government to acquire large amounts cheaply. This is the interpretation of skeptical market analysts. It forces Bitcoin holders to use increasingly desperate measures to access their wealth, creating the criminal connections that justify seizure under existing laws. It demonstrates to the public that Bitcoin is becoming risky to own, encouraging voluntary surrender. The government learned from the internet that you don't need to control the technology directly. You just need to control the infrastructure that makes the technology useful. They couldn't stop file sharing, but they could prosecute the companies that facilitated it. They couldn't censor online speech, but they could pressure platforms to self-censor. They can't eliminate Bitcoin's code, but they can eliminate its utility by controlling every point where it intersects with the regulated economy. This is a theory commonly cited by privacy advocates and civil liberties organizations. International cooperation is accelerating this process. The Financial Action Task Force is pushing global standards that require all countries to implement identical cryptocurrency regulations. The Bank for International Settlements is coordinating central bank policies to increase oversight of digital assets. The International Monetary Fund is conditioning loans on countries adopting stricter anti-money laundering frameworks for crypto. The global financial establishment is moving in lockstep to regulate Bitcoin, a shift that critics interpret as an effort to limit decentralized alternatives to state-controlled money. The surveillance apparatus they've constructed goes beyond blockchain analysis. They're monitoring social media for Bitcoin discussions. They're infiltrating online communities where Bitcoin users gather. They're using artificial intelligence to identify patterns that suggest Bitcoin ownership or usage. They're building profiles of potential Bitcoin holders based on purchase histories, online behavior, and social connections. Civil liberties advocates warn that these tools, while officially designed for criminal investigations, could, in extreme cases, enable unprecedented financial oversight if ever expanded under emergency authority. When the time comes for mass Bitcoin confiscation, according to the most concerned analysts, they'll know exactly where to look. The psychological component cannot be ignored. Every high-profile Bitcoin seizure is accompanied by extensive media coverage that reinforces public perception of risk among holders. Every prosecution of Bitcoin users is framed as protecting national security or fighting crime. Every expansion of government Bitcoin powers is presented as necessary and temporary. The same communication strategies used to justify gold policies in 1933 are being, in the view of some historians, echoed in today's digital asset environment. They're also targeting the technical infrastructure that makes Bitcoin possible. Mining operations face increasing regulatory pressure and energy restrictions. Node operators are being investigated for facilitating anonymous transactions. Software developers are being scrutinized for creating privacy tools. The distributed network that makes Bitcoin censorship-resistant is being systematically challenged at every vulnerable point, a trend that digital rights groups say may reshape the future of open-source financial technology. The timeline for broader Bitcoin restrictions, according to skeptical analysts, is accelerating. The legal framework is in place. The enforcement capabilities are operational. The international cooperation is established. The surveillance apparatus is monitoring. The messaging campaigns are conditioning public acceptance. In this view, all that's missing is a catalytic event to justify emergency action. That crisis could be a major cyber attack blamed on Bitcoin-funded hackers. It could be a financial market crash linked to cryptocurrency speculation. It could be a terrorist incident financed through Bitcoin transactions. It could be escalating tensions tensions with Bitcoin holding adversary nations. The specific trigger doesn't matter. What matters is that, in these analysts' hypothetical scenario, the government would be positioned to act swiftly and decisively to protect national security by centralizing Bitcoin under government control. The mechanics of how they would implement mass Bitcoin restrictions are already being tested in smaller operations. When the government seized that $15 billion tranche of Bitcoin in October, they didn't just take the coins. They took control of the entire network of wallets, exchanges, and service providers that facilitated those transactions. They demonstrated that they can shut down entire cryptocurrency ecosystems with coordinated enforcement actions across multiple jurisdictions simultaneously. According to legal historians, this operation reflects a blueprint. They identify a target network of Bitcoin holders. They map all the connections between wallets, exchanges, and service providers. They coordinate with international partners to ensure simultaneous actions across all jurisdictions. Then they execute everything at once, making it impossible for targeted Bitcoin holders to move their assets or warn others. The October seizure took years to plan and months to execute. Critics fear that if applied more broadly, the operation would be faster and far more comprehensive. The government has also addressed the technical problem that makes Bitcoin theoretically resistant to seizure. Private keys can be memorized and hidden, but cybersecurity analysts point out that investigators rely on established legal processes, not brute force decryption, to access digital assets. When federal agents arrest someone for Bitcoin-related crimes, they don't need to crack encryption. They use legal leverage, plea agreements, and cooperation incentives that encourage suspects to provide access. The threat of severe penalties for major financial crimes tends to make people cooperative. This standard law enforcement approach is often misinterpreted online as something more extreme. They've streamlined the legal processes to make Bitcoin seizures as efficient as possible. Special cryptocurrency courts can issue seizure warrants in hours instead of weeks. Blockchain analysis evidence is pre-approved for use in asset forfeiture proceedings. International mutual legal assistance treaties automatically recognize American Bitcoin seizure orders. The bureaucratic delays that might give targets time to move their assets have been systematically reduced. Digital asset attorneys have noted this shift as part of a broader modernization of financial crime enforcement. The government is also learning to use Bitcoin's own features in their favor. The permanent transaction history that makes Bitcoin transparent to law enforcement also makes it impossible for users to hide key evidence. If the government claims your Bitcoin is connected to criminal activity, the blockchain provides an immutable record of every transaction. You can't delete evidence that might exonerate you because the evidence exists on thousands of computers worldwide, controlled by the same blockchain analysis tools that investigators rely on. Privacy advocates argue that this creates an environment where innocent holders could become entangled in investigations simply due to Bitcoin's permanent ledger. The pattern, according to critics, is undeniable. The legal framework is constructed, the enforcement apparatus is operational, the international cooperation is established. History appears to be echoing itself with unsettling precision, and many Bitcoin holders, according to surveys and analyst commentary, express fear about what may come next. In 1933, Americans who trusted their government lost everything when gold was confiscated. In 2025, some financial commentators warn that policymakers could attempt something similar with Bitcoin under certain emergency conditions. The only question is whether you'll see the warning signs before it's too late.